Hello, everybody, and thank you all for joining us today. We have an absolutely fantastic session coming up with our expert class today. We have got three fantastic speakers. We're going to be here until around 5 p.m. There will be a section at the end for Q&A. Probably the last 20 minutes or so will be dedicated to that. We currently have around about 140 participants on, with about 350 signed up, so I'm sure people will join more as we go. There is a chat function that has been enabled, so if you post any questions that you have into the chat function, we will try and pass those over to our amazing panelists as the time goes on, and give you the opportunity to follow up with them afterwards here and on LinkedIn. The session today will be recorded, and we will send out the recordings hopefully within about 24 hours of today. We'll also put them onto YouTube as well. So plenty of opportunity for you to get involved. My name's Ben Taylor. I head up the business development and client services teams here at Conversation Design Institute. I'll be in the chat as well, helping to facilitate any conversations. So if you do need anything, feel free to DM me or speak to me in there. And I will now, with great pleasure, hand over to our amazing team of panelists to take it away.
Hello, thank you so much for that very nice introduction. Hi, everybody. This is our second expert class that we've done with CUI, which is about, should a conversational user interface have a personality? But before we get into the meat of this topic, I wanted to talk a little bit about our collaboration and our book. Basically, there's three of us. There's Saul Albert, who's a lecturer in language and social interaction at Loughborough University. There's Liz Stokoe, who's a professor at London School of Economics and previously at Loughborough. I'm Cathy Pearl. I work at Google. Currently, I'm working on Bard. Next slide. So we started working together last year when I was over in the UK for the summer. I live in California. And our purpose of getting together was to come up with an outline for a book, to submit it for a book contract that brings together conversation analysis, the academic practice, with conversation design, which is a little bit more like people in the industry building CUIs, conversational user interfaces. And we're assuming that most of the people in the audience today are pretty familiar with conversation design. Some of you may be familiar with conversation analysis, but for those who may be less familiar, in a nutshell, conversation analysis is a 50-year-old field that spans sociology, psychology, linguistics. Its core purpose is the investigation of social interaction, of real interaction in the wild, not simulated, not training, not scripted, but actual interactions as they unfold. And to do so, you collect audio and sometimes video recordings. You transcribe them in great detail. You'll see some examples of that if you haven't before. It's coming up in the presentation. And it seeks to understand the complete end-to-end interaction. And conversation analysis has uncovered a lot about the systematic and orderly nature of interaction and conversation. You might look at some of these transcripts and see, wow, conversation is so messy. There's no rules. This is crazy. But conversation analysis has really unveiled that there is a lot of order and system in there. So a lot of the pure work in and applied conversation analysis that Liz and Saul and others do identifies, describes, and shares what conversational practices constitute effective and less, effective and less effective communication. And they look at all kinds of things. They look at dates, first dates, doctor-patient interaction, crisis intervention, sales, customer service. You can apply this to all sorts of conversations. And our aim in this collaboration is to really try to speak with one voice, to bring the conversation analysis side of things to the conversation design side of things, bring them together and create a practical book that shares this knowledge. Next slide. All right, so I'm going to say there are two things I'm particularly excited about as far as this talk goes. I've been doing some form of CUI since 1999, and we have talked about persona, system persona especially, since that time. I imagine many of you in the conversation design world have spent a lot of time creating like complicated dossiers of who your persona is, how tall are they, what do they look like, what's their backstory. But the question is, does that give you everything you need to have a really good conversation with your user? And The second part I'm excited about is personalization, which I think is, I mean, that's always been a topic, but I think it's particularly hot topic right now, which is how do you craft a experience to be more personalized without crossing too far over the boundary of privacy. A lot of people, when you talk to them, will say they want a personalized experience, but then you say, well, we need to ask you this and this and this. They say, no, that's too much data. Don't do that. So this talk is another way, a better way to get at that through the conversational interactions themselves. So what we're doing is, as we develop this book, we are going to do a class, hopefully, for every chapter. And each chapter is going to have the same format, some background, illustrations from real conversations in the world, practical recommendations for CUIs, and some moonshots, like if we could do anything, what could we do? And this talk is going to be a snapshot of that for this chapter. So, and at the end, we will answer the question, should CUIs have a person? And now I'm going to hand it over to Liz.
Thanks, Cathy. So yes, I'm going to start with a little bit of background and just to start by reminding ourselves about some of the key terminology and concepts that are important for this webinar. And the first ones are the ones that you're familiar with already, I'm sure, segments and personas. So just a couple of definitions. A user segment, a distinct and relatively high-level categorical or classificatory group of customers with specific shared needs, characteristics or actions, and then a persona, a fictional character whose characteristics and goals mimic those of your ideal customer, which highlights specific details catering to their goals, motivations, or experiences. And as Cathy just mentioned, our webinar today asks whether a CUI should have a personality, which begs the question, whose personality are we talking about? So while we're thinking today about the CUI as a product with a persona, we're also thinking a lot about how designers orient to the presumed or actual persona or personality of the user. And in conversation analysis, we call this process recipient design. And so recipient design is a key term in conversation analysis, and it refers to the observation that the most effective interactions are those which are designed as sort of best fit for the parties involved. So it's all the ways by which people construct and design any turn at talk in a way that shows sensitivity to their co-participants. And so it might involve word selection, the order in which you do things, grammar, intonation, prosody, embodied resources, gestures, all of these kinds of things that we use to communicate are all part of the selections that we are drawing from to recipient design. And so in terms of conversation design, recipient design means taking into account who people or entities are to each other, who is entitled or obliged to do what or to know what the contingencies are, so how important the interaction is, for each and every unfolding turn in the conversation. And so part of our aim today is to shift the focus a little bit, not away from notions of persona and segment per se, but toward recipient design. And so rather than thinking, oh, I must know the user's age and profile as a starting point, we want to start by seeing what is effective and ineffective in real talk, in which both parties are adapting to how people show bits of each other to each other in the course of an unfolding interaction, and how we might leverage these snippets of information that we reveal about ourselves in order to get the job done. So one of the biggest challenges in designing CUI personas that we've talked about between us and especially with Cathy as a practitioner is something like this. If you're building a CUI for many users, something like the Google Assistant, if you lean into its persona too much, some people will love it, but a lot of people will hate it. Whereas a more general, helpful kind of persona, well, maybe fewer people will love it, but maybe also fewer people will hate it. And so we know from research already on things like personas that while personalization can facilitate aspects of service provision and conversation design, it also risks being discriminatory and stereotypical. And we also know that personas can quickly become literally a monotonous, because once they're in place, they're more static rather than agile, as made very famous by the person who developed the persona of innocent smoothies, the smoothie that talks to you and sends you little messages like, stop looking at my bottom on the bottom of the pack. And so while these personas can be delightful and nice, as designers, we maybe want to spend not quite as much time on this 10-page creation of a persona, and just back to basics and thinking, how can we understand what the user wants to actually do and help them? And we can do this by leveraging what we know about research on recipient design. And so with this background in mind, we can ask, how do people in real conversations alter the design of their actions turn by turn, using the evidence produced by everything that each party is actually saying in this conversation? And so now I'm going to hand over to Saul to start with our illustrations from conversation analysis.
Thanks, Liz. So as Liz was saying, people categorize themselves or adopt a persona all the time in dynamic ways in conversation. And our first example makes this basic point. For example, when people are talking for the first time, they make available information about themselves, about who they are to one another. And that information, it's not tacit or elusive, it's very manifest in the things that they do, and we can harness that. So I'm going to show you the start of a call from a prospective client to a holiday sales company. And what you're going to hear when Liz plays the clip is the anonymized audio, and it will come out line by line in sync with a very technical conversation analytic transcript. And the idea of these transcripts, it shows you exactly what was said and also how, and with what intonation, what pace, what kind of overlaps and prosody. And if you haven't seen a CA transcript before, don't worry, you'll hear the audio and then you'll see that the conventions for showing these things, overlap, pitch shifts, speed ups, etc., they draw on comic book and script conventions. They're relatively intuitive. So we're gonna play that clip now, if you would, Liz.
Good evening, Leisure Hotel. Just speaking to. How can I help? Hi, good evening. I'm trying to. I'm a lady of a certain age, and going online gives me a headache. I don't know what I've pressed now. I'm trying to do a booking. Could you check the availability?
So it's really common at the start of these encounters, people will do some kind of self-categorization work. And what you'd hope is that the salesperson here immediately picks up on this lady of a certain age self-categorization and deals with this disclosure about not being able to book online and adapts the call accordingly as it unfolds. More often, though, what we see, especially in less institutional interactions, such as conversations between friends, that we see these self-categorizations are still there, but they're a little more tacit. And there's plenty of those in our next example, if you'd switch the slide, please. So what you're going to see now is a call, and I should say this is a call before caller ID. It's recorded in the 60s at some point, but it's a call between people who, through the call, turn out to be who they are to one another, and you'll hear that happening. And what's interesting here is what is revealed turn by turn. So see if you can figure out their relationship as we go.
Hello?
Marcia.
Yeah. Hi, Donnie.
Guess what?
What?
My car is stalled. I'm up here in the Glen.
Oh.
We're just going to stop it here and look at, well, what can we infer from this conversation? One, we see that these people know each other, or at least Donnie knows Marcia well enough to recognize and guess her name just from the hello voice sample that he gets. We can then guess at the kind of situation this is, and we can see that from the design of the opening sequence. So we have a greeting, but we don't have the usual how are yous that you would get in a call between people who recognize each other from a voice sample, i.e. people who are familiar with one another. We're straight down to business. So we see there's urgency here, something urgent is happening. We also have the beginnings of what is the reason for the call in the guess what that Donnie comes out with. Guess what? So what is Donnie about to do? Or what's he about to ask or request or invite? What's his next action? See if you can guess. And if Liz, if you play the rest, you'll see if you've intuited it correctly.
And I don't know if this is possible, but see, I have to open up the bank at in Brentwood.
Yeah, and I know you want, and I would, but except I've got to leave in about 5 minutes.
Okay, then I gotta call somebody else right away. Okay?
Okay, Don.
Thanks a lot. Bye.
Bye.
Okay, so Perhaps you didn't guess that Donnie was stuck in the Glen on his way to open up the bank in Brentwood, but nevertheless, you may have heard that there was some kind of request coming. And indeed, we can see that this guess what is what we call a pre-request in conversation analysis. So Donnie's almost asking Marsha to come and pick him up and give him a lift, but not quite. He never actually has to get all the way there. She sees that this is an incipient request, and she helps Donnie avoid having to make a request that she's then going to have to say no to by giving an account that she's about to go out in 5 minutes. She does this before he actually comes out with the request. So we also see that Donnie then closes the call immediately. There's no extended goodbye or arrangements to meet. Oh, I'll see you next week when we're going to see somebody. These kinds of things, again, don't happen. So this is a situated design. It's very specialized for this urgent situation, and it harnesses and it exposes their relationship, who they are to one another, turn by turn. So this is 30 seconds long. Let's see how ChatGPT does with the same kind of situational pressure in the next slide. So you might want to see the prompts that we used here. So first, we asked ChatGPT to role play Marsha, and we supplied it with all of Donnie's original turns. And it took numerous prompts to persuade it not to generate both sides of the conversation. It finally relented. And you'll hear how we preserved Marsha's original words, where the transcript comes out, they'll come out in green. That's where ChatGPT and Marsha said the same words, happened a couple of times. Then you'll hear everything else that ChatGPT is saying read out by a text-to-speech. So if you could play the first part, Liz, thanks.
Hello?
This is Marsha speaking. How may I assist you?
Marsha.
Yeah. Hi, Donnie.
How can I assist you? Is there something specific you need help with?
Guess what?
Oh, I'm not very good at guessing games, but I'll give it a try. Did you win a contest or receive some good news?
My car is stalled.
Oh no, I'm sorry to hear that, Donnie. That must be frustrating. Are you in a safe location? Is there anything I can do to help?
Okay, so just compared to the 30 seconds it took Donnie and Marsha to deal with this situation, ChatGPT as Marsha makes this interaction 3 minutes long. So we're not going to play the whole thing, just the start and end. Although if we just show the rest of the intervening bits of transcript, Liz, you'll see that it's similarly verbose. And even in these short clips, just the start and end, they're kind of painful to listen to. But I hope you'll agree that your pain is going to be quite useful and instructive. So if you'll put up with the rest, please go ahead, Liz.
Okay, then I gotta call somebody else right away, okay?
Absolutely, Donnie. It's important to take immediate action to resolve the car issue and make the necessary arrangements for opening the bank. I encourage you to contact a reliable towing service or mechanic right away. If there's anything else I can assist you with, please don't hesitate to let me know. Take care, and I hope everything works out smoothly for you.
Bye.
You're welcome, Donnie. I'm here to help. If you need any further assistance, don't hesitate to reach out. Take care, and I wish you the best. Goodbye.
Okay, there's the end of the call, finally. So a few notes about what we see as a non-recipient design talk from ChatGPT, essentially. Marsha opens with, "Hi, Donnie," and closes with, "Okay, Don." We only get the name at the beginning and the end, and the intonation, the timing, the way that Marsha, the real Marsha, uses Donnie's name. This is part of how we show who we are to one another. The relationship allows them to skip the how are yous and get straight to the "Okay, Don." And we're done. Don's phoning somebody else. ChatGPT, on the other hand, it's ponderous, and at best it reuses Donnie all the time mid-call. Repeated use of names. Some of you may recognize this from the kinds of scripts you get in sales calls. This is sometimes scripted as rapport building, and it's often terrible. And we'll see some examples. Liz will show some of humans doing this badly later. But finally, I want you to notice how ChatGPT does not pick up on the pre-request at all. It doesn't do an offer or an account for why it can't do an offer, as Marsha does. It does this kind of long-winded advice giving, and it's very comprehensive. You can see that this has been fine-tuned to give kind of safe and responsible AI type of answers. and they're delivered in completely inappropriate ways for the situation and for the interpersonal relationships. So this is bad recipient design. And I'm going to hand back to Liz now to take us through some examples of humans doing this kind of thing.
Thanks, Saul. So yeah, I'm going to take us through 5 quick examples of different types of organizations and businesses asking its customers or its clients, its patients, its users for basic information, the kinds of things that most organizations will ask its clients or users for, the kinds of things you can see there on our mock-up form. And so the first example is simply asking somebody for their name. So whether you're filling in a form or collecting information in a conversation, we can learn a lot about how people do this in real interaction, not only how the organization asks, but also how clients respond. And so let's just see a couple of examples. We won't play them all, but I'll play a couple here and there. So this is a sales call where the salesperson asked, and what's the name, please? And what happens is it generates the first name, the surname, and an offer to spell it out from the caller there at line 3. The second one, similar, what's your name, please? But inserts madam, the category madam, to the design of the question, which is a polite, formal form of address for women in the English language, often contracted to ma'am. And so here the client again responds with her name and spells it out. And she also gives her title, Mrs. And maybe this has been somehow occasioned by madam, since both madam and Mrs. are ways to refer to adult woman in a formal way. So the question has been asked and responded to in similar ways, but also in slightly different ways. And a basic observation is that people give information in response to the simplest sorts of questions. Here's another example. This time we're going to see madam being used again, and it's going to be used and it's going to go badly. So it can be risky to use the same strategy and the same recipient design with everybody. Here comes the call.
Can I have your name, madam?
You can.
Okay, so you can. She's not giving the name, so we probably know something's up. So let's see what's up.
Just don't call me madam, I hate that. Sorry.
Don't call me madam, I hate that. Now, this could go very badly wrong at this point, but fortunately, as you'll see it unfold, the caller and the salesperson, they managed to stay on the side of amicable and affiliative. But let's just see how the rest of it unfolds and the implications actually for doing the basic task in hand, which is to get the name of the caller.
I'm trying to sound clear and professional.
Sorry?
I'm trying to sound clear and professional.
So here the salesperson giving an account for why he's using madam, and now we'll see what the caller's objection is to the term madam.
Oh, right. Oh, madam sounds like, I don't know. Yeah. I won't go there, but no.
So the thing that they're not saying is that, and for those of you who you may or may not know, that madam also refers to the name of the person who runs a brothel. And that's probably what the connotations are that this caller doesn't like. And now let's see how it ends.
And what's your address, please?
Sorry, my name is...
So the salesperson here has been kind of floored a bit by the fact that this objection to madam has happened. And by the time they get back to the task in hand, they've forgotten to ask for the name, and they get onto the next item on the list, what's your address. Fortunately, the caller's kind of okay with it, and they end still aligned with each other. But we start to ask ourselves, what would a CUI do? Could a CUI recover from this? And our research shows that even this basic task of asking for someone's name can get much more complex when titles are included and when the service provider starts to use the client's name, sometimes overusing it, like we just saw with ChatGPT. So do you use the client's first name and their surname and a title? Often these things end up incredibly jarring, mostly because we're not really looking at how people actually use names in real talk. Okay, the next example focuses on another basic task, this time asking for an email address. And again, we're going to see how a simple request can be designed differently. In this case, we're going to see the request for email, which either builds in or doesn't build in some kind of assumption about the customer. So here in the first two, we can see the salesperson asking a question as part of a list of questions. So can I have your name, please, and your email address, and what's your email address? And they're designed with the presupposition that supplying email is no problem for the caller, which it isn't. So here the salespeople have picked up something about the caller along the way that tells them this person's probably got email and this is the way I can ask them. But in the third clip here, we can see that the salesperson has this time picked up something about the caller that means that they're going to pivot to a different design. And this way of asking the question takes away the presupposition that the caller will have email. Do you have an email address at all? Which makes it easier to say no. And what we can see here is that the caller does have email, but you can also see that the salesperson was probably right to ask it in a slightly different way, because you can see by the way he responds that he has email, but he's not very familiar with using it. I have it, yes. It's what's it, Paul? Yeah. At, yeah. And it kind of does it in a chunk of information that people with email don't typically do. And now let's have a look at a final one.
That is lovely. And do you have an email address at all there? No, I don't. That's okay. More trouble than it's worth, isn't it? That's no problem.
So here, not only does the salesperson design the email task differently, they also take this opportunity right here in the moment to affiliate with the caller. And this happens because they've been listening and picking up along the way that maybe this caller isn't likely to be a heavy tech user. And what they do is they don't do this to everyone who sounds a bit old, because of course you wouldn't really want to do that, but they design for their recipients along the way, depending on how each turn has unfolded. Okay, a couple more examples. The next one is calls to a doctor's surgery, and each caller is going to ask the receptionist for a flu vaccination appointment. And in the context where we were doing the research, certain categories of people are eligible for a flu vaccination. So if you have a clinical vulnerability, if you're pregnant, if you're over 65. So if you know who the person is, you can tailor your help accordingly and progress the request in one of a number of different ways. And we analysed a large number of calls and established that if the voice sounded young, can you do that? Then an eligibility check would happen. But if the voice sounded old, then it wouldn't. So these are the kinds of things that we saw in the materials. So we might have an explicit eligibility check. So here, the caller was asked if they could book a couple of flu appointments for a flu jab, and the receptionist comes back with, did you have it last year? No. Okay, are you eligible for a flu jab? Yes. And then they proceed to make the appointment. Compared to that explicit check, we can also see sort of more implicit ones where the receptionist asks, yeah, of course, what's your name? So here they're eliciting the patient's personal details and their record, which is going to help establish eligibility without having to actually ask questions about things like pregnancy or clinical vulnerability or age. Those things now don't need to be sort of part of the conversation, which might be a good thing. And now let's have a look at our third example.
Good morning, inquiry speaking.
Oh, good morning. Could I book an appointment for a flu vaccination, please?
You can. Are you able to come down to Thursday's clinic?
So here the appointment is given without a check being done because the voice sounds old enough to the receptionist. And what is it that is old in this voice? And phoneticians can describe things like the slight global hoarseness, extra periods of mid-term creakiness. It's slower, there's some disfluency, these sort of technical phonetic qualities to the voice. But what we can also see is that the call is shorter and the progress of the task happens faster. Now, of course, it can be really problematic to read a person's age or other aspects of who they might be incorrectly. So we'll finish with a couple of examples of getting it right and getting it wrong. So this example is about printing. So imagine you're a service provider and sometimes you need your user to print something at home. So like we saw with the email questions, you can presume they have access to a printer without checking, or you can do something to check and sort of show that it's kind of okay to not have a printer and not expect that as part of the conversation. And this is maybe especially important for this context because they come from Swedish social services data collected by a colleague, Marie Flinkfeldt. So here we've got a question or a part of the conversation where the social services presume that the person they're talking to has a printer. You can print this out on the website. Here's a check. Can you print it from the website? In this particular case, the caller doesn't have a printer, and then we also see that the burden is now going to be on the client to be able to do it and then encounter delays if they can't. And then a third one, which asks it in a different way. Do you have the possibility to print the forms, which doesn't require the kinds of things that we see in the first two? And it's unfortunate, really, that the first two more presumptive or burdensome examples are asked of folks who don't have a printer. And especially in the first one here, where the conversation then starts to get longer, problematically longer. And it also involves unnecessary disclosures from the client. So in the first one, the caller is getting divorced and so has to disclose that her ex-partner has the printer and all her other possessions, which you feel like shouldn't really be in a conversation about printing stuff. So we can start to see that if you're not really thinking about your recipient, then you can make these clunky moments, awkward moments in the conversation. And so finally, this example is going to stick with this issue of presuming things about a person as we interact with them. And here it's going to be exposed in an egregious way. And this is a call between a member of the public and a community mediation service that deals with neighbour disputes. So this neighbour, like lots of people who call, have got a dispute with their next door neighbour. And in this case, it's a noise problem. And we're going to just join the call where the caller is talking about the problem with his next door neighbour is that it's the people she mixes with and she lets them use her house for a particular kind of party. So let's see if you can see how the mediator is tacitly miscategorizing the caller and their motivations.
The people she was mixing with, obviously I felt that they were using her house as one of these blues parties, that goes on.
Oh, right.
She's West Indian, so she'll have reggae parties and stuff like that. And I mean, she hasn't had one for some time now. But as when she first got in. But we did have racial abuse in December, and a couple of times since then.
Racial abuse.
Yep. I'm Asian. My wife is West Indian.
Oh, okay.
Okay, so here's the bit where we see that the mediator is surprised to hear that the caller is Asian and his wife is West Indian. So just listen to that little moment of surprise again.
Oh, okay.
And so far what we can see probably is that the mediator has been considering this person who's talked about his West Indian neighbour having reggae parties as probably white and maybe racist. And we see this moment of exposure, and it leads to all sorts of further awkward unfolding conversations as it keeps going. And this is the final bit.
Such as Packy family, etc.
Oh,
right. And finally, you can hear though that different. Oh, right. The mediator now understands something completely different about the situation that he's dealing with. Okay, so I'm now going to pass back to Saul to see what can we do with all of this, with all of these examples that might take us somewhere more practical.
Thanks, Liz. So what we want to know really is how to bring conversation analysis and recipient design into conversation design. So looking at the examples that we've just shown, remember that everyone is categorizable in myriad different ways, and people self-categorize all the time explicitly. We can harness those in our conversation designs for specific recipients and specific situations. Another point to make, going back to Liz's introduction, is that market segments, user categorizations, and also on the production side, bot personas, these are not static things that we construct before an encounter or use as the basis of an interaction. They can be generated and adapted live in an unfolding conversation. And finally, if we use recipient design in this way, it can enable what conversation analysts call progressivity in conversation. That is frictionless, efficient interactions that move along from one turn to the next, from one action to the next. So now I'm going to hand over to Cathy for some concrete examples from conversation design.
All right, so this is a fictitious CUI, but you can think of it as a text-based chatbot, some kind of travel planner. And someone, is saying they want to plan a trip to Turkey, and the first thing the bot does is ask for the budget. And the person maybe doesn't know. Now, in sort of a more traditional fixed CUI, at this point, the user's kind of stuck, the system's kind of stuck, because it has been taught that the business rules are, in order to help someone plan a trip, you must know certain things, such as the budget. So it will not let the user progress in the conversation until that slot has been filled, essentially. Because from the business's point of view, if you have a very backpacker budget, you're going to have a completely different trip than if you want to stay at 5-star hotels. So it feels, well, you don't have the information I need, so I can't really help you. And in this case, you can see that the CUI explains like why I need this, but the user isn't ready. And so they just say forget it and they hang up in the huff. And one thing we know from research is that when you ask too many questions up front of a user before providing them with any information, it can be very frustrating for them. Sometimes they want to know something, even if it's not the exact thing, and not just stop them in their tracks. Next slide. So what could we do better? In this example, when the person says they don't know what their budget is yet, the CUI says, no problem. I can still give you some general ideas. You can make it more specific later. And here you go. It doesn't get hung up on the fact that the user doesn't have a budget yet. Then the conversation kind of pivots a bit because the CUI says, well, what would you like to do? And then you find out that the user, actually, they're not even quite ready to plan a trip. It's like, this is their dream to go, but they don't have a budget yet. They don't have a plan yet. But the CUI doesn't have to end the conversation. It can still progress and say, oh, sounds like you're dreaming about this trip. And just like a human would, maybe it says, well, what are you so interested in about Turkey? Oh, I read a book when I was little, and etc. So I think the point of this is to say that often when we design CUIs, we have a very specific business goal in mind, a very specific rigid way that the user must go through it, when in fact, we don't know where the user is in their journey. And the thing about this interaction that can be very effective is that you might help a user through their journey. Maybe they're in the stage where they really are going to go to Turkey, but they don't know how long, where, etc. And rather than just say, well, you don't have a budget, you don't know when you're going, I can't help you. If you provide some information up front, it might actually help the user progress. Just like a travel agent would, they say, well, here's an example of an itinerary where on the low cost side, or here's an example of the places you can go. And now the person is more engaged, like, oh, thank you. Now I realize that I want to go for 2 weeks, or now I realize that Turkey's actually not where I want to go. And so rather than just say, we have a rigid task that we must do, you help the user progress regardless of the exact state they're in by learning turn by turn where they are in their journey. Next slide. All right, so a little bit about moonshots. What we mean by moonshots is if we could wave our magic wand and have our CUI do whatever we wanted, what would we do? Next slide. And I think that the example I just showed you where the CUI engages in a conversation about like, oh, what do you like about Turkey? That is a bit of a moonshot. The first part about responding to I don't know is practical and immediate. We can already handle that. But really getting into it the way a human would is maybe further away. But basically our moonshot is, what if a CUI could adapt turn by turn to the emerging evidence of who a person is, what do they want in a particular conversation, and adapt. So rather than define your entire persona and script up front, assume you know which bucket your user is in before the whole conversation starts, can you do it as you go? And I was just thinking about a real world example. I was just in the UK a couple of weeks ago, and I was at a garden store buying something, and I was buying Tunnocks tea cakes, which Liz introduced me to last summer. And I was buying milk chocolate Tunnocks tea cakes, and the woman was very chatty, the cashier, and she said, don't you like the dark chocolate ones? And I said, well, my son prefers the milk chocolate ones. And so I didn't have to tell her that, but here I am giving information about myself. I have a son, he likes milk chocolate. And then she said, well, the dark chocolate ones are very hard to come by, so you might want to pick some up while you're here anyway. Gave her a chance to upsell, right? Because we had this little chat. So, if you're a business and you are building a CUI to sell things, that might be a great opportunity for you. Next slide. So to finish up, we're going to actually answer the question for you. Next slide, which is, should a CUI have a personality? Yes, and, to do the whole improv thing. So yes, it should, as we have often talked about as conversation designers, as the research has shown. We know that users are going to assign a persona to your CUI, no matter what you do. I mean, humans assign personalities to their cars, to their pet rocks, all these things. So you do want to get ahead of it and make your own decision, even if it's a pretty neutral persona. That's still part of the persona, and you want to define something. And it is important for the CUI to design for the recipients in an agile rather than just a static. So don't have a predefined script where it has to follow this. It could be that as you find out certain things, like where are they in their plan to travel? Are they in the dreaming stage? Are they ready to hand over their credit card? Adapt to that a bit, and you can still help them. And if you're thinking about customer service and sales and things like that in that travel planning example, okay, maybe that person isn't ready to pull the trigger and book the trip, but maybe you're helping them in a way, and that a year from now, they're going to come back and be like, oh, it was so helpful when I talked to that bot. Now I'm ready, I'm going to go back. So it could be, you know, more the long-term game as well, to have a good customer experience. And one other thing about persona. So as we talked about in the beginning, often when we're writing our personas for the bot, we're talking about like, oh, maybe they're really bubbly or they're really cheerful or whatever. But sometimes that can be very hard to manifest when you're actually just writing, you know, responses for a CUI. What does it mean to be a bubbly, you know, I didn't understand that, versus non-bubbly? And it's not always helpful to progressing the conversation. What we're trying to focus on in the recipient design case is what's more helpful is to read the room, to read each turn as it comes, and design your responses to go with the conversation and not have everything predetermined, which may or may not apply to your user. All right, that's it. We have some time for questions, so feel free to ask. And also, I love hearing where people are from. People are from all over the world, I think.
So we have a question in the chat, and we also have some that were sent as part of registration. So I think what we'll try to do is answer as many as we can in the 15 minutes that we have remaining, and invite you, if you didn't get the question answered, that we will answer them on LinkedIn. So feel free to go to the page where this webinar was promoted and tag us, and then maybe we can come and try to answer them there if we don't get everything done now. And I can also see that they're in a couple of places, I think in the Q&A, but also I think I can see a couple in the chat itself. So let me just scroll back up. Ben, I don't know if you're looking at the webinar chat. I can't look at that and the other thing at the same time. I don't know if you're there.
I am indeed.
Yeah. So shall I start with a couple of questions from the registration while you're finding the ones from the webinar chat boxes? How about that? Yeah. Sounds
good.
Okay. So here's the first question. Is personality more important than ever if using generative AI? I don't know whether Cathy or Saul want to have a go at that one. I think some of these questions might possibly have been preempted in terms of our stance on this stuff by the webinar, but I'm just looking at Cathy and Saul now to see if either of them want to say yes or no to that one.
I can take a stab at that one. Yeah. I don't think generative AI changes the need one way or the other for the persona definition, but I think it gives you more flexibility and power to do recipient design. So in my opinion, you still need the same sort of initial definition of the persona of your LLM, but you can take advantage of the more dynamic nature of an LLM, hopefully, and respond better to each turn rather than have a very rigid script that you've predefined.
Yeah. Okay, here's another one. What are the ethical considerations or framework in recipient design? Saul?
Yes, I love that question, because actually recipient design is really built out of ethics in a slightly different sense. So often we think about the ethics of data anonymity or data sharing or user privacy. But if you listen to the ways that people talk to each other, what we see is a kind of morality in conversation, people's rights to certain knowledge and obligations to do certain things, respond to certain things or not. It's really just inbuilt into our every conversational turn. So I think, although perhaps this isn't answering your question as directly as it could, I don't think we can get away from ethics when we're starting to look at things turn by turn. It just gives us a much finer grained control over how our bots relate to people, what kinds of information they solicit from them, and how delicately or not they do it.
Yeah, and if I could add, again, back to this personalization problem we have, where it's like, you could go down the route where you ask permission to the user up front, can I have this information and this information and this information? I'll use it to personalize your experience. But then you're holding on to that information, usually like in their user profile. Whereas as Saul was talking about it, it's like, it's much more transient. Like maybe you learn in the conversation that they have a child, but you don't save that information. You only use it in that one turn or whatever to figure out, is it helpful for the conversation? And then it's gone again. Just like a real human you might meet in the store and never meet again. They don't have you on file with all your information. They just learned about it, they've forgotten about it. And that's perhaps, hopefully, a slightly more ethical way to do it if the user chooses to reveal that in the conversation.
Maybe one more from the registration questions, and then I'll see if Ben's ready to ask us some as well. So how important is personality for text versus voice versus avatar? How do these different modes alter the need for and effectiveness of sharing personality? Maybe I'll have a quick go at that first and see if colleagues want to join, because this is the kind of question that people often ask me more generally about conversation analysis and you know, what's the difference between the spoken mode, the written mode, and so on. And I think, at least for me, the starting point is to think about action and what are people actually doing more than modality. And this probably also speaks to another question where someone's asked about how much does gender play into bot persona. For me, always you would start with, what is it that people are trying to do? So if they're making a request for a lift, or if they're asking for a flu vaccination appointment, think about the action and how that is designed, or how that would be responded to, before you start to try to augment it in some kind of way that speaks to a so-called gendered style, which there's lots of research would argue that doesn't really exist, but we do believe it does. And the same for thinking about text versus voice versus avatar, because if you start with this basic concept of action and how to get people through an encounter in the way that's most helpful, that's going to be a better starting place than to think, well, I'm writing or I'm speaking or I have an avatar. That would be my answer to that question. I don't know whether Cathy and Saul want to add something.
I guess the one thing I would add is that when you're dealing with something like an avatar, you have to make more decisions. So the text to voice, you have to make a decision. What is your TTS going to sound like? Because it's probably going to be gendered. Then you go to avatar. What is your avatar going to look like? So you do have to spend more time thinking about some of that stuff, because it's very hard to have sort of this neutral avatar. I mean, you can have like an animal or something like that, but it just means you have to be making more decisions, because your user will be making more judgments about your system persona the more information that they
have. Ben, do you have questions? Have you picked some from this, because they're in the Q&A and the chat, so I'm struggling to sort of see them.
Yeah, there's a few that have come in both, and I will try to consolidate a little bit, and then we'll send them out to you afterwards if we can't get any through. Right. So, there's been several that have come through about recipient design, so it's probably worth looking at some of those. And two questions that I'll put together. One of them is a question around practical ways to implement recipient design when designing flows. And then the second question is, do you have any good resources for continuing to learn about recipient design?
I might think about resources. I don't know whether Cathy can say something about flows.
I think what I would say, so I imagine this question is saying, like, I don't have an LLM, I'm doing a more, traditional based kind of CUIs where I have a specific flow. And I think in my mind, you just end up having perhaps more decision trees where, for example, if we go back to the trip planning, you might beforehand say, okay, you're going to categorize your users into like, ready to buy, almost ready to buy, not ready to buy, let's say. And as you go through your flow and you get clues into that, you could, go over to the flow that handles that particular user segment. Like, oh, this is a person who's very early stages, we have a flow for them. Oh, this is the person who's like ready to hand over their credit card, we have this flow for them. And so you just going to have some decision points in your flow to help you decide which set of, which kind of interactions you're going to have with them.
Great. And I've just posted something in the chat, something that Cathy, Saul, and I and another colleague wrote about conversation analysis, design and moonshots, but it includes some more about recipient design and some links to other research on that.
Great. So, and the next, there's two or three that are around the importance of personas when designing chatbots, partially from convincing stakeholders, and other times where, is it, can you definitively say it is important to help designers? So could you sort of talk a little bit more about the importance of personas when you're doing the designs?
I'm happy to have a little go at that. This might be controversial, I don't know. But having had a few conversations recently with with sort of software developers who are developing flows through their product. I don't know all the right names for some of these things. Each time the focus for me has been much more on, but this way you're asking this question to get this information, or this way you're responding to this thing that the user might say. That's every time we come back to that first, much more important than what the avatar looks like, or whether it's got a particular tone of voice. And that tone of voice can often be quite grating quite quickly because it's invariant and static every time. And the whole point of us of recipient design versus persona is that you're changing what you do each time subtly, rather than kind of sticking within that same tone of voice or persona, however it's manifest. So at least what I see in engaging with companies is we always start by fixing much more fundamental things around action, progressivity, getting people helped in the thing, and less about the sort of snazzy design aspects, which seem not as important. That's what I'm saying.
Can I add something to that as well about the kind of need for them? I would say that personas are not the kind of preliminaries to interaction. They're not the things that you need in order to do interaction. They're kind of the outcomes of interaction. You can't avoid having a persona. So if you're going to have one, and there is going to be one, then the real trick for the designer is actually eliminating the aspects of that persona that maybe you don't want, and dealing with the fact that it's going to be there whether you like it or not. So you might as well try and have some control over it by designing for the situation, for the relationship, and as Liz was saying, for the person.
Great. So there's one here. So do you think the overall goal of being flexible and agile is achievable in a traditional NLU powered system, or would you require jumping into generative AI?
I think that it is possible. I think perhaps it might be easier, especially the future, to do so with something like an LLM, but I think it's still very possible in a traditional flow-based NLU system. Again, it's not that you're going to have like maybe a complicated, 10 different directions to go at every turn. I think it's more that you're going to establish sort of, like, go back to the technical, like, getting someone's email. Let's say you have to get someone's email. Maybe you have two flows, that one of them is like the flow for somebody who seems pretty tech savvy and it's probably going to be easy for them to get an email address, and the flow for somebody who maybe seems less tech savvy and maybe is having trouble giving their email address. Maybe you have to go more slowly. Maybe you have to, do more confirmations. It doesn't mean that every single turn has to have some kind of, we have to have 10 different ways to go, depending on what they say. It's more like, as to, what Liz was saying earlier, what's the action trying to be accomplished? You have to get their email address. Okay, so focus there. What are the types of different ways people might interact with that? Or you have to have them print something, or you have to know, when they're leaving on their trip, that they don't know. So again, go back to what are the absolute things you must achieve in the conversation, and then decide how those could go in different ways depending on where your user's at, and come up with some different flows and decision points for those in particular.
Great. Okay, so we've got 3 minutes left of the call. So if we try and maybe just do one more, and again, it's a little bit of a grouping, and there's a few questions here about how to sort of remove bias or influence when you're creating personas. So your own, putting your own bias into it or removing it from it.
I mean, I think that's a really important question, and we see it very clearly in some of those examples that we played with humans messing it up and showing their bias as well. So, the last thing you want is to kind of design those things into a static-ish conversation where you can't pivot away from it when you've made a mistake or expose some bias. So again, for me, the sort of rather more boring answer is to think, what are people doing? What do they want to get done? And keep it as neutral as possible first, rather than what I would see is quite often adding a lot of stuff to the design that is trying to give those the CUI turns or the chatbot turns something either more human or just more or unique or more sort of personality sounding. And because each time you do that, you're going to risk, if not exposing or being actually biased, but just not working for the actual recipient. So it feels like it's a risk every time you add something like this in, and stepping away from just the progressivity through getting this thing done.
I think just speaking about generative AI in general, as we know, these LLMs and things are trained on vast amounts of data that do have bias. And so if you are creating a model like that, first of all, assume there will be bias, and it's, you know, your job to sort of seek it out and figure it out. And one of the ways to do that, of course, is to expose to trusted testers in different groups. Like maybe you have some trusted testers in the disability world, or in the, you know, a particular area of the world, and you, with their permission and compensation, you say, hey, can you do some testing with me? And, you know, if you notice those types of biases, let us know. And then what you can do is you can capture those, and then you can use them and write, you know, better responses for your model and train the model to try to steer them away from some of those inbuilt biases.
Amazing. And almost on cue there, just as we hit the hour mark, we will wrap it up there. And thank you for all three of our panelists today. Thank you for all the questions that everyone shared. Apologies if we haven't got around to getting to yours. As mentioned a couple of times, they will be shared. This expert class is something that we try and do for our alumni and our paid students on a really regular basis, and you know, it's great that we've got speakers of the caliber that we have today, and you know, you can continue to get access to these by you know, when you take our courses in conversation design. So thank you very much to everyone who's come along. We do have another open classes coming up at the end of the month. We will be in touch with you with more details around that. We'll also be in touch, as I mentioned, via email with the recordings from today. We will try and get those out within 24 hours, but if not, definitely by the end of this week. So thank you, everybody, for attending. I look forward to seeing you all at the next class.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye. See you next time.
Bye.